We want to thank you for coming. And I know you were expecting cupcakes, treats, music, but
Really, we're just really worried about you and we want what's best for you.
And we want you to know this is coming from a place of love and we truly care about you.
No. Please sit down, please.
This might be hard to hear, but
We're staging an intervention.
An education intervention!
as always, let me tell our new audience members a little about our show. Every week we pick a different literary topic and come together to talk about the topic and relevant authors. Our goal is to make complicated concepts more accessible because literature is for everyone. I'm your host, Tish Ray Movich Fields. Before I bring out the rest of the team to speak, I'd like to give some background information about the concept of double consciousness. Double consciousness is a term coined by W.E. Du Bois in his book, The Souls of Black Folk, written in 1903. Du Bois was born in Massachusetts and later went on to study at the University of Berlin and Harvard. At Harvard, he was the first African American to earn a doctorate degree, and later he founded the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. Anyways, back to double consciousness. Double consciousness is a psychological experience of internal conflict one experiences by looking at themselves through the eyes of a white oppressive society. Du Bois defined double consciousness as being both a positive and a negative thing, saying that it was negative because it made it hard for Black people to feel a sense of identity, but also saying it was a positive because it allowed African and American identities to be merged in a way that people could be proud of. Double consciousness has also been described as a gift, something that imparts special knowledge and insight to the person who has it. In The Souls of Black Folk, Du Bois says, "One ever feels his two-ness, an American, a Negro, two souls, two thoughts, two unreconciled strivings, two warring ideals in a dark body, whose dogged strength alone keeps it from being torn asunder." Along with Du Bois, many other prominent African-American authors have used the concept of double consciousness in their works, both before and after the term was famously coined by Du Bois in 1903. Today, we will hear about how these authors use double consciousness in their work, as well as how these texts are in conversation with each other.
Thank you, Tishrei. To further our conversation about double consciousness, I am excited to talk about our next influential writer, Amiri Baraka. Born in Newark, New Jersey to middle-class parents as Leroy Jones, Baraka has always been on a path of evolution, and more importantly, revolution. His work, often deemed controversial, so do check in with your parents prior to reading any of his other work, aims to fight against the social systems that he finds suffocating and detrimental to the cultural expression and liberation of the Black community. Some examples of his life that speak to this point begin as early as his rebellious high school years, to him abruptly leaving his bohemian lifestyle in Greenwich Village, New York, in favor of immersing himself into the predominantly Black neighborhoods of Harlem, New York, and his hometown of Newark. We can learn from Baraka's life the importance of our own self-evolution and allowing the trials of life to guide us exactly where we are supposed to be in this world. So take that really hard math or science test as an opportunity to show yourself your own personal growth. You guys again? Now that we have familiarized ourselves with who Amiri Baraka was as a person, we can explore his piece of work written in 1964, The Revolutionary Theater, to flesh out his representation of Du Bois's double consciousness. In this piece, Baraka uses harsh and combative language in order to describe a theater where the victims of society become the playwrights and heroes, while white America will be forced to watch the fruits of their hatred and be hated for it. The Revolutionary Theater represents a force of aggressive change, but who is the true audience for Baraka's description of the theater? And what does this even have to do with double consciousness? Well, to answer these questions, let's dive right into experts from Amiri Baraka's The Revolutionary Theater. Sorry guys, I just got distracted. Our first excerpt of this eye-opening essay reads, "Our theater will show victims so that their brothers in the audience will be better able to understand that they are the brothers of victims, and that they themselves are victims if they are blood brothers, and what we show must cause the blood to rush." Double consciousness is often described in connection with the metaphorical veil. So while Black people are gifted with the ability to see themselves through a white gaze for social integration purposes and self-preservation, a veil is also formed. In this excerpt of the Revolutionary Theater, we can interpret the plays of this theater to be the lifting of this veil and the exposing of the true pain of Black people and other victims of society that they are normally forced to hide. Whether this veil has shielded an individual from his victimhood or even shielded a social perpetrator from his victims, the Revolutionary Theater works against this status quo in true Baraka fashion. Great book, by the way, great book. Anyways, the closing of the essay goes as follows. This is a theater of assault. The heroes will be Crazy Horse, Denmark Vesey, Patrice Lumumba, and not history, not memory, not sad, sentimental groping for a warmth in our despair. These will be new men, new heroes, and their enemies, most of you who are reading this. This concluding sentence directly addresses the outside group, a group that can be assumed to include white people. This sort of response to the audience legitimizes that the white gaze exists. This is a reference to Du Bois's concept of double consciousness, which needs the existence of a white gaze in order to be legitimized. Baraka furthers this concept by demonstrating how the white gaze can intensify to the point of monitoring Black affairs as curiosities and encourage white people to engage in Black spaces where they don't belong, according to Baraka. Because of their ignorance and the efficiency of Black people to veil their pain and alter their presences with regards to that white gaze. So while Baraka may not have subscribed to the notion that Black people should alter themselves when directed by their double consciousness, he does engage with this topic, and in his essay, places a more unforgiving spin to it.
I'm here today to talk about the very special James Baldwin. Baldwin was born in Harlem, but he later moved to France, which is where he did most of his writing. Baldwin explored many aspects of African American identity and focused on creating a more complex characterization of Black identity than many other writers, including, quite famously, queer Black identity. He was also quite an animated speaker, and if you want to learn more, I'd suggest going to YouTube and watching him debate in interviews and give talks at other universities. He's really quite captivating. So I'm sure many of Baldwin's writings could potentially be connected to double consciousness, and I encourage you to decide for yourselves what other pieces of his talk about double consciousness. I'm going to talk about how Baldwin compared double consciousness to a trap in his piece, Everybody's Protest Novel. This piece was responding to another work called Uncle Tom's Cabin. Baldwin thought Uncle Tom's Cabin oversimplified identity and attempted to categorize people into boxes. Sound familiar? He described how people endlessly struggle towards and endlessly struggle from the trap of social categories, which is roughly linked to how society forces double consciousness on Black people. It's this double-edged sword of the struggle that we should really pay attention to here. Similar to Du Bois, he discusses how the trap of double consciousness is not reality. He says we bind society together with legend, myth, and coercion because we are afraid of the truth. In contrast to Du Bois, Baldwin is much more in his feels than the original theory. He is talking about how society is afraid to recognize our true selves, and this makes individuals themselves also afraid to confront who they truly are. This is where Baldwin really sets himself apart. He argues that social pressures enforce this constraint, but it also means that individuals struggle to accept themselves because of the trap of double consciousness. Baldwin was also pushing back against this idea that Black people have to resist a certain way or pass a certain way. He was against some of the really strong pressures within the Black art space that tried to enforce an aggressive and militant form of resistance. Instead, he wanted identity and resistance to be as complex as humanity itself. So Baldwin really found double consciousness to be a bitter struggle and wanted Black people especially to try and free themselves from it, to explore themselves more completely.
Hey y'all, so happy to be back here with you. It's your favorite lady, back again. I am so excited to be here to tell you and all of the starry-eyed kids out there about the very famous Zora Neale Hurston. And more importantly, her view on double consciousness. Hurston, born in Alabama and raised in Florida, is a world-renowned writer and anthropologist, meaning she studies the way humans work. During Hurston's life, she published short stories and books and produced plays, something I'm sure some of you all will be doing one day. However, equally as important, Hurston also dedicated her life to educating others, just as 101 serves to do for us today. So, just as Hurston wanted, we will be educating you all by looking into a certain piece of hers, how it feels to be a colored maid, to see what she has to say about double consciousness. As a quick summary, Zora Neale Hurston writes the a younger version of herself, maybe just as young as some of you out there today, who moves from Eatonville to Jacksonville, Florida, and slowly becomes more and more aware of her race. As a whole, the story is about a girl who attempts to overlook her racial identity in order to force others to treat her like an equal. In other words, she's fighting for the golden rule. In this short story, Hurston held a very particular view on double consciousness. Namely, she rejects it. Hurston not only rejects the idea of double consciousness, but she also rejects the notion of race as well. Although this seems like a challenging notion, essentially, she strips herself down to just who she is as a person. Remember, kids, character is the most important part about you. Hurston writes, I remember the very day that I became colored, at the very beginning part of the story. To set the precedent for the story, Hurston challenges the idea that color is a biological, permanent thing. To refute the idea that race is biological, Hurston writes, I feel most colored when I am thrown against a sharp white background. According to her, race and color is a malleable characteristic that is situationally and socially constructed. Along with all of this commentary on how her race may change from time to time, she makes the point that even if it seems like social environments have painted her out to be different races, Hurston herself has not changed at all. It's important you make sure you never let anyone change you, no matter what circumstance you're placed in. She writes, among the 1,000 white persons, I am a dark rock, surged upon and overswept, but through it all, I remain myself. And later she adds, the cosmic Zora emerges. I belong to no race nor time. Hurston makes many points about not being defined by her race or even pointedly overlooking it, inherently refuting the argument that all Black people possess double consciousness. Although this isn't exactly Du Bois's argument, they both agree that double consciousness does not reflect one's true identity.
Hey guys, it's your girl Tishray again, and I'm going to be talking about another author that uses double consciousness, Paul Laurence Dunbar. Paul Laurence Dunbar was born in Dayton, Ohio in 1872 to two formerly enslaved people. He grew up in Dayton, and he began writing poetry and stories when he was still in high school, probably at the same age as some of you viewers. After he graduated high school, he quickly became an influential African-American author and poet.
In his poem titled We Wear the Mask, Dunbar demonstrates the concept of double consciousness by talking about the mask that Black people often have to wear in order to survive in a white society. Dunbar writes, we wear the mask that grins and lies. It hides our cheeks and shades our eyes. Double consciousness is at times thought of as a veil, one that covers Black people's true realities and actions. The mask that Dunbar writes about acts in the same way. It hides how Black people truly feel about their social and economic situations because it could be dangerous for them if they allow white people to see any of their unhappiness or discomfort. In order to live in a white-dominated society, Black people must smile and play along with white people's expectations of them.
Dunbar also alludes to the sense of inner conflict that is embodied by double consciousness. He writes, with torn and bleeding hearts, we smile. This contrast between smiling and having a bleeding heart suggests that what is felt on the inside is not shown on the outside. It also suggests that people who wear the mask are not happy that they have to do so, and in fact, it is causing them great pain and suffering. Finally, the word torn implies being pulled apart by opposite forces, and maybe a metaphor for how people feel when they are wearing a mask. Always torn between what they truly feel and what they must show on the outside. It's also interesting to note that We Wear the Mask was written in 1895, almost 10 years before Du Bois famously coined the term double consciousness in 1903. This shows us that even before there was a phrase to describe it, the feeling of two-ness and conflict that double consciousness describes has been around for a long, long time. Overall, Dunbar's We Wear the Mask is a perfect example of an author describing the concept of double consciousness and how it feels to have a veil over oneself.
Hi, welcome back to Katie's Cooking Corner, where I serve up some delicious literary facts for you. This might be my favorite week ever on 101. I am so glad to be here to talk about my favorite writer, Lucille Clifton. Clifton wrote about so much more than double consciousness, including her own family history. In Clifton's words, she sought to act as a mirror for minority children through her own career to show that anyone can be a writer and that poetry is for everyone. I just want to take a moment to extend a message to the wonderful young people watching this today. and say that you are all talented and brave and you too can be a writer someday. Or, if you don't want to be a writer, then a scientist, an academic, a baseball player, a lawyer. Whatever it is you want to do, I can't wait to see you do it. So back to our topic of double consciousness. Today, I will be sharing the wonderful poem, In the Inner City, with you, and I will be explaining how Lucille Clifton sees double consciousness through this piece. In the inner city, or, like we call it, home, we think a lot about uptown, and the silent nights, and the houses straight as dead men, and the pastel lights, and we hang on to our no place, happy to be alive, in the inner city, or, like we call it, home. Clifton first calls the location of the piece the inner city before correcting to call it home, in order to speak to the burden of being able to see oneself from both a white perspective and your own perspective. This is how the poem both opens and concludes, emphasizing the importance of this change in mindset. Furthermore, by the ordering of the two consciousnesses, the first line emphasizes the dominant white perspective and allows the poem to conclude solely on the word home, a choice which allows readers to ruminate on the speaker's own perspective, the Black perspective. Clifton then talks about their no place, which shows white Americans' deliberate ignorance of life in the inner city, specifically, or as the Black community in general. In that respect, it describes the anonymity that comes with ignorance imposed on a collective people. This no place can provide potential personal protection, yet collective discrimination, an interesting double consciousness within itself. Clifton is reclaiming this deliberate ignorance, using it to show the potential positives of double consciousness. With this reading in mind, it is evident that Clifton is using the definition that Du Bois gave us about double consciousness, that Black people are able to see the world through two separate lenses, and that it can be a positive. Namely in this piece, that it allows one to build a community that provides safety and anonymity from specific white eyes. In this piece then, I think that Clifton agrees with Du Bois' theory of double consciousness and is building on the theory throughout her own perspective. Overall, In the Inner City is a great way to see double consciousness in action.
Well, that's it for this week's episode of 101, Double Consciousness. I really hope that you learned a lot about double consciousness and you feel more confident going out into the world with this newfound literary knowledge. We'll see you next week for the next episode of 101.